Hello, everyone. So good to see you. I'm not going to say my name because you should surely recognize me from the photo. And in fact, I'm not going to introduce the panelists because, again, you have their names and bios in the materials. And we want to jump right into this event and have a chance for you to ask questions, not just at the end, but if you are moved to say something brief or ask a short question, you should feel free to jump up or raise a hand. There are people with microphones. I may not call on you if I feel that the flow is going well, but you can give it a try. And I will ask questions to some of my friends here, but not all of them at once, so that, again, you can maintain your attention and interest in what we're discussing. So let me ask Karlijn first to describe when she realized that a specific story she was working on was a big story. When was she unable to keep herself from telling somebody close to her, not at work, that she was really doing an amazing story, even though she wasn't supposed to tell that person?
Yeah, that story started by coincidence. So I was working with a colleague on a story, and we got a bit stuck. It was a story about Russian oil being exported to other countries despite sanctions. We were stuck in that story, but I was looking into the question of how does that oil that is sanctioned by Europe and other countries, how does it end up in markets? And I was looking into these shadow fleet ships. These are ships that are used to evade sanctions, to still transport Russian oil despite the sanctions. And it was just a lost hour or an hour or two where I was not really finding a story. And then I saw one of these ships entering Dutch territorial waters. So I was just kind of spending time, not really going after a specific story, but just exploring. And I think that's something I want to stress here, that creativity and sometimes a lost hour or two can bring you to a very important, very good story. The moment that I saw that ship entering Dutch territorial waters, I knew that we had a story, because the Netherlands and other European countries, we don't want these ships. We do a lot to prevent Russia from gaining money from the export of oil. So the fact that these ships that were sanctioned could enter Dutch waters, that from the beginning it was clear that that was a story. In the end, we found out why they came to the Netherlands. We explored the holes in the system, so poor oversight, etc. Different organizations that didn't collaborate well. But the beginning was that we saw these ships entering our territory, and we knew this is a story, because that's something that nobody wants. That's something that we, as the Netherlands, have said that we want to prevent.
Thank you so much. James, Karlijn.
Hi.
Sorry?
Hi.
Hi. And feel free to introduce yourself, since I didn't do that, if you want. But Karlijn did not answer the question when she just had to whisper to somebody close to her, not from work, that she had a great story. So you don't have to tell us whom you told, but tell us about...
I won't tell you who I told.
Tell us about that time when you just couldn't contain yourself. You had to blurt out the fact that you were on such a big story. And what was the story? And
Sure. So one that immediately comes to mind was, this was some time ago, and I'd had a phone call, funnily enough, from Gerard at the end of the end here. We'll get to him. And he said, hey, I've got this data. Would you like to have a look? You know, we haven't started a project yet. And I got on a plane to DC, and I was sort of locked in a small room with a standalone computer. What they had was this data set that had been stolen from HSBC by a guy called Hervé Falciani. And this data set had ended up through a circuitous route with the ICIJ. And what it was internal banking data. So it was bank account details mainly. And that was quite simple. It gave you the identity of the people who had these accounts in Switzerland. But in itself, that wasn't a story. Yeah, okay, that's interesting, but what's the public interest in that, for a start? Because they might not have been doing anything wrong. So we need a bit more than that. Anyway, I'm sort of in this room, going through the stage and trying various things to find interesting material, and doing various searches, and not having much luck, until I stumbled across these documents which were internal bank documents written by bank officials. And these were really interesting because these actually were records of meetings or telephone calls or visits by clients to the bank in Switzerland. And what I realized was, some of them were things like, clients come in from London, they've asked for £10,000 in used notes. It's like, wow, what's that for? But the key thing, the really interesting thing, was when I realized that there was one word they were using to identify bank accounts which had not been declared to the tax authorities. And that word was undeclared. And then I did a search for undeclared, and I got about 30, 40 hits, and those were the stories. And in that moment, I knew I had not just a story, but a film.
Great, thank you very much. Alison, you are an editor more than a reporter, so the stories come to you from your reporters most of the time. And can you recall a time when a reporter came to you and said, I have this story, and you fell off your chair and said, no way? And what was that story, and what happened to it?
That has happened a few times. I am an editor at ProPublica now, and when I got there, I began working with a reporter who had a story whose premise was absolutely bonkers, which, if you know the United States, this was a story about Oklahoma, which is a rural state, an oil state, and the story was about how a Chinese national in the U.S. had gone into a illegal marijuana farm in the center of Oklahoma and gunned down 3 other Chinese nationals who were working there. And the local nonprofit journalism organization called us to work on a story like, what is going on here? And the story just got bigger and bigger with how many marijuana farms illegally registered in Oklahoma were owned by Chinese nationals, and our reporter had specialized in money laundering by Chinese nationals in the U.S. of drug money from Mexico, so all of a sudden this was getting very complicated. But then as they continued to dig, and we have fantastic researchers who are digging through Chinese language social media in the US, they found a picture, a photograph in a Chinese community center in Oklahoma City. And it featured several of the people we had identified as owning illegal marijuana farms in Oklahoma, as well as the Chinese ambassador to the US and the top Chinese official, like not the ambassador, the next level, visiting Oklahoma and taking photos with all these people. And then we went through and identified them. They did, I shouldn't say. I was the editor cheering them on. And of about 11 people in that photo, 9 of them had criminal convictions for either violent crimes or illegal drug crimes. And at that point, we were like, oh, now we have the Chinese government involved officially in this story. And it led to a series of in the end, 5 stories about the marijuana farms, about the money laundering, about the Chinese government's role, and about potential human trafficking. And that photo was that moment we were like, oh, now we have the goods.
So you've brought down not just Supreme Court justices, but Chinese marijuana farmers.
With everything.
Gerard, ICIJ has won so many awards in your time there, and even nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. But when did you know, let's say, that the Panama Papers would be a big story? Not when you won the award. Presumably you knew it before that. Tell us, really, when you knew.
That exact moment? Look, the exact
I think your microphone is off.
Hello? Sorry, yeah, I'll borrow that. Sorry about that. Look, I think the exact moment was about 2 or 3 weeks before publication, when we were sent an image from Iceland, from our reporter there, Johannes, who basically sent us a photograph. Oh no, actually, it was actually the day we published this photograph, and I think James will remember this moment. There were basically thousands of people that had surrounded the Parliament building in Iceland, and they were throwing yogurt and bananas at the building, demanding action, because one of the key characters in the Panama Papers was the Prime Minister of Iceland. And I think at that moment, when I saw that photograph come through, I knew we had a great story. But I need to explain that not everybody did think, right up to publication, that we had something. I mean, you might look back on a big story like that and think it was so obvious that it was going to be huge all over the world. But we had a lot of problems convincing some of the media to actually join us in that project. But again, when you see people reacting, when you see people getting angry, that's when you know that you've hit something really important.
All right, I see a hand there. Sir, if you can ask or say something quickly. Wait, microphone on the way.
Sure. This panel's called How to Find Scoops, and so far 2 of the 4 stories are about somebody gave you a bunch of documents. What do those of us who do not get handed documents do?
Okay, I'll
I'm happy to, yeah.
I can do that.
sure. Everybody wants to answer. Why don't we let Gerard start, because I think, and then you two can pick up.
I was actually going to address that because I think some of the important things to remember when you're an investigative reporter is you actually don't need to know anything, but you have to know that your audience, your publication, whoever's reading your story can often be your best source. I think, some of my best stories over the years have started very small. I mean, we talked about the Panama Papers, but in fact, the lead up to that was many years earlier when we started looking at offshore tax havens and started publishing stories about it. That led to more and more sources coming forward with more information. I mean, I learned this 30 years ago when I was investigating police corruption in Australia. I started basically by publishing a very small story, that was almost, about bad behavior by police, and then other police who were concerned about that started contacting me, and then over a period of about a year, I started getting bigger and bigger stories. So often, you don't need to start with something. It's not a data dump. It's actually just being persistent and identifying a potential story.
Alison, maybe. Do you want to answer?
Yeah, please. I think there's a myth that most people just get handed documents as journalists, and that's not at all what happens. If you do get handed documents, it's usually because you have been covering something for a period of time and have established a reputation, or you've asked the right people for something. But I just want to talk a little bit about how ProPublica last year in the US, as I'm sure most people know, the Supreme Court overturned the right to abortion. And last year, ProPublica published a series of stories where we showed that women had actually died specifically as a result of the fact that in their states, abortion had been banned. And that started out with a reporter who had been covering the issue, looking very carefully through death records of women and looking for the records that showed that women either had been pregnant. There are very graphic things that can be listed on a death record that suggests that the woman was either pregnant or having a miscarriage or something. And that's how that started. And then she reached out to the family. It took her a year to get that family to talk to her. Then they gave her their daughter's medical records. So that didn't fall into her lap. It was a huge amount of work.
But you didn't rely on a leak either. You
No, there was no leak.
So establishing some credibility on an issue, and even at a small level, getting called in as a member of a consortium. James, did you have a response to the idea?
Yeah,
that you don't always have a leak?
No, unfortunately not. Persistence, really. And also, I worked for 10 years investigating FIFA and making films for Panorama about FIFA with a very great journalist called Andrew Jennings. And we spent years trying to get evidence of how this marketing company, ISL, had been bribing FIFA officials. And we made two films. We made a certain amount of headway. And then we started making a third film. And it was actually someone who we already knew, a contact we already have. I thought we should go back and have a conversation. And I wasn't hoping for much, but thought we'll get something. And we went back to see him. We had a meeting with him, and as Andrew was expounding, what we were doing and why we were there and blah, 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 I could see him reaching down to a briefcase and sort of half pulling out an envelope. And eventually he pulled it out, and I said, he's got something for us, Andrew. And it was a list of 100 million payments of bribes to FIFA and other sporting officials. So, yeah, that was a leak, but that was hard won by sticking to the story, refusing to give up, and just going on and on and on, persistence.
And Karlijn, I think your example of watching ships come into Rotterdam or whatever was another example of persistence.
It is, and I think persistence is very important, but what really helps finding a good story is also searching for a broken promise or for a goal that has not been achieved. In the case of the Shadow Fleet ships that I explained about, it was easy to make the point of the story because the Dutch government had already said that we don't want these ships, that these are bad. So we didn't have to make the moral argument. It was made for us already, and that makes the story much clearer. Another story I'm working on right now is a story about people living close to the airport, Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands. They are being disturbed in their sleep by the noise from the airplanes. And you can write a story about how sad it is for these people and how bad it is. But the moment that we knew that we had a story was that we found out that Schiphol, the airport, and the Dutch government had promised for 30 years already that the hindrance for the people living close to the airport would not increase. And we saw that it increased. So this broken promise, that made the story. And I think you can look for these broken promises or goals unachieved in many topics, and that makes the story much stronger than just a moral argument.
Let me ask Gerard to estimate what percentage of the stories that he started to investigate actually became stories, and then what percentage of those stories became big stories. I'm imagining a funnel, and the numbers aren't, of course, so important as the experience of having to experience disappointment.
Yeah, look, you get contacted by a lot of people. I think we get about 5 to 10 tip-offs a week, and very few of them ever end up being stories because a lot of what people think is important to them is not necessarily important to everybody else. I mean, I can use a very silly example here. So if Alex walked in here wearing a teapot on his head, he might seem a bit eccentric, but if half the people in the audience here were here with teapots on their head, then we'd have to start asking ourselves, is there something wrong with the water in Perugia? So again, you've got to really question from the very beginning, is what this person is concerned about really of concern? And you've got to question that, because if you can question that and interrogate that at the beginning, you've got to save yourself a lot of time afterwards. But you know, I just want to talk about when you do get a big document dump, it is really only the beginning of a long journey, because you've got to find a lot of patterns that are in the documents. You know, I go back to the Iceland example that I mentioned before. It was really through the persistence of a reporter in Iceland that made that a story, because we saw the Prime Minister of Iceland in the documents almost from day one. But he had registered this offshore company at a time when he was a businessman, before he became a politician. So if we had published that story right away, like we were tempted to, it wouldn't have been a story. He would have easily defended himself. It was really the persistence of the reporter in Iceland who found that this prime minister had sold the company to his wife for $1 the day before new rules came in that would have asked him to disclose this. But also, the reporter in Iceland, Johannes, he went through all of the bankruptcy records in Iceland over a period of months and found that one of the creditors was this mysterious offshore company that the Prime Minister hadn't disclosed. So that was conflict of interest, which made this a great story, because this was a Prime Minister who had been elected in Iceland to oversee who was going to basically benefit from the collapse of the bank. And so he had a personal conflict of interest. And that's why there was so much anger there. But it took a lot of persistence and work by Johannes to get it a story.
How long did Johannes have to spend isolated in a room, protected against retaliation, to do that story?
Well, he figured that Iceland was so small that if he told anybody about the story, going to your point, I think the only person he did tell was his wife, because he had to explain how he was going to absent himself from work. He gave up all work. He relied on his wife to basically pay the bills. He was getting a lot of grief from his in-laws saying, oh, he's now turned into a bum and he's not working anymore. But he was determined to do this in isolation because he knew that if the word got out, that the story would be ruined.
James, I understood from your answer before that you feel there's a value in doing stories that may not be big stories in order to develop the big story. And is that a conscious decision? Well, let's do this story even though it's not so great, because it will establish some contacts and some momentum?
I think sometimes, well, actually I got very interested in tax and offshore use of offshore to avoid dodge tax. And I got interested in that in the sort of mid-noughties, before the financial crisis. And I pulled together a pitch for a film about tax dodging, which I thought was really interesting. And it wasn't commissioned. And the explanation was, well, you know, everybody does it. You know, this isn't, what's the story? What's the public interest? And that all changed, of course, with the financial crisis. So suddenly that was something worth pursuing and considered worth pursuing. But also, you know, we did, before getting to Swiss Leagues or anything like that, I'd already done a whole series of films about tax. And that was sort of building up a sort of knowledge base, a range of contacts to sort of take that forward. And it was a long time before you got to a story that really took off.
That's persistence even in the face of your own news organization or the commissioners of a story. And I wanted to ask Alison, if I could, have you killed stories, told reporters, no, we're not going to do that, and then felt, oops, that could have been a big one? I mean, is there always a sense that you might have left a big story on the floor?
I've killed stories that I was doing that I wished I had then pursued. Sort of a self-kill, which was very painful later. And it was a story about a medication that the drug company had really jacked up the price. And I believed that they had jacked up the price and also hyped up the results of the medication in order to increase their sales. And there'd been a lot of reporting on the price issue. And in the end, after talking to people for months and documenting a lot of this, what I realized is the only real problem with people buying this medication was the price. It wasn't about the effectiveness. I don't want to name it because I never did the story. But later I realized I was being too cautious. You know, I should have documented all of the steps, even though in the end it came down to the problem of the company jacking up the price, which had been well covered. But the other effects probably were important to write about, and I had talked myself out of it. And I think that's a problem sometimes with investigations, is by the time you get deep into it or close to the end, it can seem like old news to you, the writer or your editor, and you have to convince yourself that this is still going to be shocking to somebody else out there.
Arlen, if I may ask you, how important to you in assessing the potential magnitude of a story are colleagues or partner organizations, when you're developing the story, obviously you're keeping it close because it's your story, but do you need to somehow sensitize yourself to, or check your own sense of how important this really is, and how does that work?
It's really important for me, and when I don't work with leaks, I try to talk to friends a lot about the stories I'm working on, because it helps me building the story, building the argument. So that's very important. And I wanted to add something about killing stories, because I don't really kill stories. I put them in the fridge for a while. I look into possible leads all the time, and there are a bunch of stories that I don't work on at the moment, but sometimes you also have to wait for the right moment to start a story. I had been looking into exploitation of Chinese migrants coming to the Netherlands under a special visa program. They were to work in restaurants, and we had heard stories that they were being exploited, that they were not being paid, that it was a form of modern slavery. But we couldn't really finish the story. We didn't have enough. And then COVID came. So all restaurants were closed. And we saw in the figures that these migrants were still coming. So these migrants supposed to work in restaurants that were closed, that didn't make sense. And that COVID moment that made the story that we had in our minds for years, then we could suddenly prove that it was bullshit, that it didn't come to work in restaurants, but that they came to work in other sectors and got exploited. So put them in the fridge.
Thank you. Gerard, ICIJ, by its name and its basic approach, collaborates with media around the world. And so I guess when you have a story and you put it out to partners or potential partners, you get some feedback. And what's the experience of not getting a lot of interest from partners? And does that deter you? Does it spur you on? What's that dynamic?
Yeah, look, we generally, how we find a story, we basically prepare it a little bit before we approach media partners, because we realize we only have one opportunity, basically, one shot to get Karlijn interested. And so it's got to be one line that you get them excited about. And I guess the bigger the surprise, the better the story, potentially. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the stories, are turned down by media partners. One of the ones that I was a little bit disappointed in was we had this amazing story out of Angola about the richest woman in the world, Isabella dos Santos. And we did get a lot of media buy-in in the end on it, but I was disappointed about the number of people that were interested in that. And I think it was because at the time people thought, well, Angola, rich woman, is there really a story there? But eventually, we did end up with a fantastic story. I think James actually won an Emmy for it. And it was again, an example of you've got to believe yourself in a story sometimes. You've really just got to push it forward.
Can I add something to that?
Of course.
We're one of the partners that did jump in on that story, but I think what's important for my media organization and many others as well is that just a story about a woman in Angola wouldn't make it into the Dutch newspaper, so we had to look for a Dutch angle, and that in the case of Isabel dos Santos there was a big Dutch angle, like a lot of her firms were registered in the Netherlands, but that's really a weakness that we have in journalism, that I can't sell the story to my editors when there's not a link to the Netherlands, even though it's an important story maybe.
James, Alison, please talk about collaboration as an ingredient in a big story, both in finding the story and then in developing it with partners. How much importance does your organization and do you put into that collaboration?
I've had various experiences with collaboration. I think overall, it can really add to your story. And we do a lot of collaborations with television, like Frontline. We'll do an investigation, and Frontline will make a film out of it. it also has a huge amount of complication. And so it's sort of a give and take about whether or not you want that complication. But, you know, we had a story, and I was thinking about this when you were talking about putting a story in the fridge. This was when I was at AP. A reporter had a really interesting story about a guy who had gone undercover in the Ku Klux Klan in Florida on behalf of the FBI. But it seemed very local and specific and a little bit old. And one thing he had gotten, which nobody else had, were the surveillance, the video from the surveillance that they had done and the audio wiretaps. And that was kind of made it interesting, but it was still not a great, so I put it aside. I said, we can't focus on this. And then later on, when George Floyd was murdered and the issue of police violence and racism came to the fore, all of a sudden this story seemed really interesting and important, and so we went ahead with it, and then ABC News came and they wanted to create a documentary. And as we were going, the gentleman who went undercover came out to us. We didn't know who he was. And we did the whole story based on the documents and the tapes, and then he came and talked. And so they did a documentary, and he was on camera, and he was interviewed, and it really came to life, and it was fantastic. But it was a lot more work, a lot more time going back and re-reporting things with the cameras and retreading things. So it brought it to a huge number of new people, though. And so there's a cost benefit in doing those partnerships because your story's going to take a lot more time, a lot more resources, a lot more energy.
Thank you. James, please, on collaboration. BBC maybe doesn't need to collaborate so much, but how?
No, I think collaborations are great. I would say that. No, both on a small scale, like with individual. I mean, we frequently partner. In fact, funnily enough, we sometimes partner with Frontline as well, or we'll partner with a UK newspaper that's doing the same investigation at the same time. Maybe that just organically grows. Sometimes it doesn't work. One of the first collaborations I ever did was with the Guardian newspaper, and it was about British aerospace and arms dealing and Saudi Arabia. And 3 days before we were due to broadcast, 4 days before, I got a call from a contact saying, by the way, we're about to go to press tomorrow. As in, we're going to gazump you and do the story before you. We actually turned it around and got it out. So you need trust, you need some sort of structure to make it work. So with the ICIJ, that's worked, but we've done other collaborations with other people. And I think what you really get for it when it's spectacular is when you've got a data set like you had with the Swiss Leaks investigation or Panama Papers or Pandora Papers, where, you've got individual stories which are good for a lot of countries, and then suddenly you're all publishing at the same time. That almost creates a huge impact of its own and a huge momentum.
That can make a story big.
It makes the story huge. I mean, we had in Panama Papers, we had a sort of okay story about David Cameron, our Prime Minister. I mean, the story was kind of out there about his father having an offshore fund, but we had more information, we had documents, so we did the story. But nobody anticipated it. It went absolutely huge, to the extent where internally they were saying he might have to resign. What we didn't know is he had actually invested in the fund himself. So that was sort of unintended.
Right.
Can I jump in there? I mean, just
Please.
in what you're saying about when you have impact because so many people publish, you can also do that on your own. And one of the things that we have found is if you take a big story and break it and put it out over several days, maybe by subject or serializing it, it creates a drumbeat that makes a big story reverberate more, especially in this sort of, when everything's on the internet. People can go back and read your first story when they find the third one, and that is really powerful rather than a huge splash and then disappear.
A great example of that for anyone who hasn't seen it is how The Atlantic handled their story about the Signal chat and published a bit about it, and then the officials involved said stupid things that were false. And then the next day or the day after that, The Atlantic put out the actual chat text and sort of caught those officials with their pants down. So, you know, that is building momentum in a particularly effective way. Any question, comment from the audience at this juncture? Yes? Please, sir.
I had a question about pitching a story as a junior journalist. It helps, of course, knowing someone, knowing an editor in person and building trust. And that happened in conferences, but conferences are often expensive and freelancers don't have that budget. What kind of advice would you have for a freelancer that wants to write a cold email to one of your editors?
A bit off topic, but I think we'll tolerate it.
Look, I mean, I'll start. I think Alison probably will answer this better. I would say keep it short. The worst thing you can do is write a 4-page detailed pitch because editors are very busy. They often don't have time. You've also got to get right to the point. Like, what is the actual story here? If it's been reported before, you've got to make sure that you have that in there with the extra angle that you have. But yeah, my overall advice, keep it really short.
I agree. And when you said junior reporter, I mean, what we do is very much deep, heavy investigation. So we want to know that if we accept your pitch, you're going to be able to execute. So I would say keep it short, make sure it's a big story. For ProPublica, we have a portal where people can pitch freelance, and we do have somebody who goes through it every month. But you might need to have somebody who can vouch for you, who can say, yes, this person can handle it, because we would background to make sure that before we accepted the freelance that we knew you could execute.
Am I right in saying you also don't want to oversell it? You don't want to pretend it's a big story or make it seem a big story when it's not. And so I'd like to go on and ask each of you to... Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, don't just think of approaching an editor, because you might notice that there might be a journalist in an organisation who's particularly interested in the thing you've got something on. So maybe approach them rather than the editor and see if you can do a deal, i.e. get in through them, because they're in a much better position they'll assess your story and then they'll go and talk to the editor.
Did you want to say anything?
I agree.
I love it. A question there, please. You have a microphone.
Yeah, thank you. Have you noticed any change in your relationship with your sources in the past year or two? It feels like relationships are becoming more tense, more difficult. Is that the case?
I would say, well, in the United States, with the way that things are going right now with the federal government, actually we are having quite the opposite, which is government workers never speak to the press before. And now we are getting a lot more, we are treating them with great care and protecting their security and identities, but we have a lot more interaction with government employees than we normally would have in the past.
Gerard?
Look, I mean, I always feel that as an investigative reporter, you're better off not getting too close to sources. There's this thing called insiders and outsiders. I think you very much need to be an outsider. I do think your sources can be anybody. And I do think that you have an obligation when you do talk to somebody first to really try and, to Alison's point, to actually protect them from potential discovery. So the more you can educate them at the beginning, the safer they are at the end. Often the mistake is made by them at the beginning with the way they contact you as to whether or not they get outed.
Isn't there, though, right now a whole new market of information coming from intermediaries who get on the dark web, find information, and then want to sell it to journalists? It's a sort, not a leaker and not a hacker, but just a stumbler upon what appears to be useful information in the dark web, and that presents you with real challenges.
Yeah, there's so much information out there at the moment because a lot of corporations around the world are being hacked all the time. You probably read about this every day in the papers now about your pension fund being hacked or a bank being hacked. A lot of that information does get offered to journalists, and these people do want to get paid for it, which does present a lot of ethical dilemmas for us. But one thing we always look at when we do get the material is whether or not it's in the public interest, and that's the one good thing that, you know, that journalists can do. We can, if it's in the public interest, I think you should accept the information no matter where it comes from. But of course, you should never pay for it. I'm not suggesting anyone should. But that's when we go to lawyers and try to get, you know, clearance and make sure that we're not overstepping any ethical boundaries.
I think somebody has a question here, tentatively raising her hand.
Hi. Sorry, I have a question.
Oh.
Here.
Ah, okay.
Okay. Two questions, short ones. The first one, is it something that you're taking into consideration, the numbers of the unique visitors or the viewers that you anticipate you'll have on a story? This is the first one. And the second one, about the impact. You talk about the public interest and the big stories. Is it a big story for you, something that you publish and it affects rather minorities, but not such a large group of people?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Who'd like?
I mean, I'll talk a little bit about at ProPublica, our guiding star of how we choose stories and follow them is accountability, which means if we're going to look at a problem, we're going to try to figure out who's responsible for it. We're not just going to describe a problem. And potential for impact. We can never say there will be impact, but a problem that can be potentially fixed or at least improved. That often is about corruption, government mismanagement, things like that. We do not, I mean, we know who is looking at our stories and which ones are widely read and which ones are not. Often what we'll do is if something's not being widely read, we will re-up it with a different headline. We'll move it, we'll do more social media because we believe that all of our stories are important. And we definitely take into account, we don't only look at stories that are gonna affect the widest swath of people. In fact, we try to look at stories where the most vulnerable people are being harmed and look at ways that we can expose those kinds of harms.
Would you like to?
Yeah, we don't talk about numbers of readers or visitors when we decide on whether to make a story or not, just because we can't predict it. How we choose the stories is by defining some important topics of public interest that we think are urgent at the moment. And that's how we decide what stories we work on and what stories we drop. And that can be minorities when that relates to a topic of public interest. So that's the way we choose, not...
I think we've heard here a consistent focus on accountability, as Alison called it, and trust, as Karlijn called it. So what indicates to these folks that there's potentially a big story there is when someone or some institution needs to be held to account. And I guess I would ask, in the absence of another question, tell us quickly of a time, because we only have a few minutes left, 6.5. There's a big clock here. When did you feel, Gerard, that you had a big story, but it didn't get big? I mean, you did it, but it just didn't have the impact or the effect that you had expected.
Oh, yeah, look,
We'll end on a down note.
Yeah, I do think that at the heart of every good investigation, there has to be some sort of systemic failure for it to work. And I do think that the role of the journalist is to say and to point out that something's wrong, because then society really should fix it, and it's your job to scream loudly and say, this is broken, please fix it. A few of our stories have not resonated. We did one last year, actually, about a pipeline in Kazakhstan that we thought was a very important story. We didn't get a lot of buy-in from media partners, which should have told us a story about that. And it didn't really take off in terms of the way other stories have sometimes done. So not every story works, but I still think that the importance of that story was there. And now, thankfully, there is now some reaction to that story. I think the guy at the center of that, and I'm not going to name him because he's still trying to sue us, or at least threatening. But he is now paying money back, a lot of money back to Kazakhstan. And I think actually Karlijn just won or has been shortlisted for a major award over this story. So maybe you can expand it more.
Yeah, I think there's also a certain amount of luck in whether a story flies or not. Because I think that story about the pipeline in Kazakhstan was a very important story. We did it very well, and still it didn't go anywhere. It has to do with timing and a bit with luck as well, I think.
James, do you have a
so
to describe?
Well, as I said, both in terms of tax stories took a long time. I mean, we did some really good, I think we did some brilliant investigations into tax, but they were sort of, they weren't picked up more widely because the climate of the times wasn't kind of receptive. It was sort of, it hadn't reached a sort of critical point. Which
changed.
But that did change. But also, again, going back to FIFA, when we started making films about FIFA, most of the press, sports press, and FIFA and the entire sporting world sort of poo-pooed us and sort of, or ignored us as an irritant. And it was only through, later on, well, really in 2015, when the FBI started arresting officials, then suddenly everyone, oh yeah, gosh, they're corrupt. But that was a story where for a long time it felt like you were...
Now FIFA is a clean, transparent operation.
Wow. Wow.
You got to keep on it. You got to...
You fixed it.
Keep that big story coming. Alison,
I'm just going to have a look.
I just said you fixed it.
Well, did you want to tell us about a big story that turned out not to be big?
I was actually going to tell you the opposite. Sometimes we have stories that the reporters think, oh, this is a neat story, and we're kind of like, okay, you can do it, don't take too long. It's like a not mediocre, but like a good story, but not one of our big stories. And then they just take off.
Give us an example.
So last fall, I had a reporter who was doing a lot of work. He got a huge database about medical payment records. And we were working on that, and he's like in the middle, found this little nugget of a story about a company whose entire role was to reject medical claims for big insurance companies. And so he wrote literally in 2.5 weeks a story about this company that did this and how it would dial up the rejections or dial them down depending on what the insurance company wanted. Oh my God, the reaction was crazy. It got more readership than, it was probably in the top 12 of our stories last year in terms of readership. And this was in the middle of like a year and a half of dealing with this database. The story had nothing to do with the database. And we were like, oh wow, yeah, that was a good little story that we did.
And we know that U.S. healthcare is a story that can engender very, very strong actions.
Yeah, those stories resonate. As we know, people don't like health insurers in the United States.
Do I see through the fog any... A flop? Oh, okay. Please.
Yeah, I have a question. I come from a non-profit working on promotion of sustainable forestry, and we were in the target of ICIJ a few years ago related to a story about forests and how illegal logging is happening across different forests. And so my question is about, because we think that our system is not perfect, but it's the best golden standard that exists in the world. So I was thinking, how do you put safeguards in place to make sure that you don't damage the good guys and rather go to the bad guys? Because we are in the 1% that is shown to be like the best we can have in the forestry, but we felt that the report was not targeting the 99% where the real bad things are actually happening.
Yeah, I worked on that story as well. I think a few things that we look at is scale. So we look at the big players often. And what I said before, we look at the promises an organization makes. So we check whether the promise an organization makes of what you can gain from a certain standard, for example, whether these promises are met. So we don't make up what makes a story, but we check with these parameters. And I think that, I don't know the details of the case, but I think that is for us how we decide where to focus on.
Thanks very much. We have literally 8 seconds left, and they're very strict here. I think what we've heard is that accountability is the motivation for the big story, and it doesn't choose friends or enemies. It's not about clickbait. It's about changing the world, and these are organizations that have done that, and I'm very proud to have moderated this panel with them and to have seen all of you. Thank you so much.